Now, just when you thought things couldn't get even more complicated in the Mideast, they got more complicated. Iran irate about Saudi Arabia's execution of a prominent Shiite cleric, and that caused Iranian protesters to set the Saudi embassy in Iran on fire. And since then, both countries have been fighting a war of words. Michael Hanlon from the Brookings Institution, he's kind enough to join us to tell us what all this may mean for the U.S. Mike, good talking to you as always.
Nice to be with you today.
Okay, put this in 101 terms for a public who's so weary of seeming unending conflicts in the Middle East. From the Saudi and Iranian side, they've taken opposite sides in the different civil wars in both Yemen as well as Syria, obviously. How could this escalation of tensions between the two give the immediate concern to the broader Mideast here, what the fallout could look like?
Well, first of all, putting it in basic terms, I'm not sure that I see the rupturing of diplomatic ties as a fundamentally major or surprising event. In some ways, I see it as codifying the reality that existed even before the execution of the Sheikh. In other words, the relations were so poor between Riyadh and Tehran that this just sort of formalizes a reality that was well on its way towards happening anyway. And moreover, if Iran and Saudi Arabia decide they want to cooperate or communicate in some future case, they can still do so through all the other countries that are involved in these various peace processes or conflicts, especially in regard to Syria, where, as you know, half the world is involved and the United States has leadership. We ourselves don't really have proper ties with Iran, but in these very multilateral settings, these various settings where we come across Iranian diplomats, whether it's the Iran nuclear negotiations or now the Vienna process on Syria, we have the opportunity to communicate with Iranians, even if formally we're not representing or acknowledging each other's diplomatic missions. And therefore, I'm not going to make too much of the Saudi-Iranian split at this juncture. But all the rest of the fundamental differences that you mentioned are still very serious causes for concern. And there, I think, we're going to have to tackle them one by one. Rather than hope for some fundamental recalibration of Sunni-Shia relations or Iran-Saudi relations in the region, we have to find a way to wind back one of these wars at a time. And that's going to take good, hard diplomacy and perhaps some greater use of military tools in a place like Syria, where right now I think our strategy is simply not working. So that's the path forward, one place at a time, one problem at a time.
You know, Mike, there was the thought that obviously we saw the controversy and debate over whether or not we should engage Iran in the nuclear deal. Reportedly, there's already been some violations. We've seen more isolation of Iran even after the latest incident that happened at the embassy. Where are we with Iran? Are we better off than we were a year ago? Is it just as bad that it's just more window dressing surrounding this? How isolated are they, and where is our relationship with them as it stands today?
Well, you have to answer the question in a couple of different ways. First of all, in terms of regional conflict, we are essentially in the same place we were a year ago. We are on different sides of the Syrian conflict in many ways. I guess there are some common concerns, especially ISIS. But in terms of our view about Assad, we're on different sides. We're on largely different sides in regard to Yemen. We're very concerned about Iranian influence and infiltration in Iraq. So in the broader regional context, we're about the same as we were at the start of 2015. However, we are in obviously a much different place with the nuclear deal now having been blessed and concluded and essentially ratified and entering into force. And what that's going to mean is that Iran will be far less isolated on balance in 2016 than it was before. Even if most of the region is still very nervous about it, it's going to now have access to its cash, to various foreign markets, to arms purchases, to a lot of foreign interlocutors outside of the Middle East who have been waiting for the day when they can do business with Iran again. And in terms of whether Iran is violating or complying with the basic nuclear deal, you're right, there are concerns, but overall Iran is complying, which is why it's about to get all this money released, because it has shipped out the uranium stocks that it was supposed to. and it is now moving towards dismantling centrifuges. The basic disagreement about compliance has to do with how much information they've given about past research into possible bomb design. And I don't really expect that we'll ever get to the bottom of that. And I'm not sure we need to, as long as we deprive them of the capability to build bombs they may or may not have theoretically figured out how to construct. So on balance, we are seeing Iranian compliance. But if you don't like the deal, you should probably be unhappy about Iranian compliance, because it's going to allow them to then get to the next step and access all that money.
Mike, you've said in so many words, we got to make some priorities and make some certainly course corrections in the Middle East. Do you have a worst fear scenario that if we don't get this thing right sooner than later, it could spiral into X? What's the worst case scenario you see here for the Middle East that could draw us back in again once more?
Well, you ask about worst case scenarios. I'm tempted to hearken back to a comment one of my colleagues made. Whenever you think things have gotten as bad as they can in the Middle East, just wait another day, because they could still get worse, and they often do. But apart from that kind of gallows humor, certainly I'm worried about the long-term potential for an Iranian nuclear weapon. My guess is that won't happen until the 2030s, that we probably bought ourselves the 10 to 15 years with this deal. But long-term, and 2030 is not that incredibly far away. It's only as far away from us now as the 9/11 attacks are going in the other direction in time. I think that Iran could well break out. Another concern is certainly that you could have violence in the key oil-producing countries, or that the Persian Gulf itself could be subject to ongoing hostilities of an active nature. So far, we have this happy world in which, for us in the West and most people around the world, we're still getting incredibly cheap oil and gas. And if you had told me 10 years ago that we would have Iraq and Syria and Yemen in flames, and Libya too, and that gas, that oil prices would be down to $30 a barrel or so, I wouldn't have known how to make sense of those two contradictory arguments. But somehow we're living in that world. So yes, things can get a lot worse if Saudi Arabia, UAE, Kuwait, the main oil-producing countries or areas of the broader Middle East region wind up being threatened by the same violence, and then we start seeing $200, $300 a barrel price for oil. So that's one way in which it could get worse. It could obviously also involve a lot more people getting killed, and a lot more attacks like the Paris attacks or the Ankara or various other, the Sinai aircraft bombing. A lot of the things that happened around October, early November of 2015 could start happening routinely and frequently. So these are some of my worst case worries.
And on that happy note, Mike, I dragged you into it, but I certainly appreciate a few minutes as always. Mike O'Hanlon from the Brookings Institution, thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, coming up next, we're going to come closer to home. Mayor de Blasio halfway through his term, so it's time for a midterm report card. How's he doing? And we are not grading on a curve.